America's First Amendment has come under attack many times in the past. Some of the most flagrant abuse occurred in Montana during and after World War I. In our Montana Moment from Deer Lodge, Kevin Mackey visits the Sedition Exhibit at the Old Montana State Prison Museum.
Between 1918 and the early 1920s, 40 men and 1 woman came to the old prison to serve time for sedition. In this cold, former cell block, sunlight spotlights their mugshots. Most of them were European immigrants.
Austria, Germany, Switzerland, Finland, Norway, none of these were criminals. People came to this country to get a better life. And they believed in the First Amendment, the freedom of speech.
In 1918, Montana enacted the Sedition Act.
It was the harshest law in Montana. And then Congress came in and adopted Montana's act into the federal law.
Heather Gregory says freedom of speech could be dangerous, especially if you were an immigrant.
It's not that they weren't patriotic, it's just that they didn't want to fight their brothers and sisters from their homelands. And so they just voiced these opinions. They had to spend 8 years, 20 years in prison for saying something that we say every day.
The world these men came to is still here. They would have lived in one of these cells. More than 80 years later, University of Montana journalism professor Clem Work was interviewed in a documentary called Jailed for Their Words. He wrote a book on these men and women called Darkest Before Dawn.
I thought that, perhaps someday these people would be exonerated.
The book spurred a UM law professor to engage his law students.
I sat down with my law students and I told them about the book. I think we can obtain pardons.
Professor Work worked with his journalism students to find descendants of the sedition prisoners. Their work led Governor Brian Schweitzer to grant posthumous pardons.
After every one of those cases were studied by the University of Montana School of Journalism and Law School, that these were patriots. These weren't seditionists.
The Powell County attorney at that time wrote,
"The cases are a caution to us in the present day that even in a democracy, the government can suppress free speech and the thought by inciting fear in the population and equating dissent with disloyalty."
Like today, in 1918, the world was in the throes of a pandemic. The Great War stoked fears of foreigners. With help from then-current inmates, Heather spearheaded this Sedition exhibit.
The inmates from the new prison, they were the ones that put it all together for me.
She says in the nationalist fervor of the time, people became informers.
People were encouraged to rat out their neighbors. A lot of these individuals here, they were in their own homes when they were saying the things they said.
When we come back, how families were torn apart over words.
This segment of the news.
Montana's Sedition Act of 1918 could devastate lives. A slip of the tongue, a passionate sound-off that went against the grain would come at a high price. Kevin Mackey continues our Montana Moment.
Ben Kahn was a traveling salesman. He was in a saloon in Red Lodge when he told the wrong person, "This is a rich man's war, and we have no business in it."
And the next thing this gentleman knew, he was downtown in a cell. This is Martin Verkovich. He was the one person that spoke out because he didn't want to fight against his brothers in his motherland.
Herman Bausch, a German immigrant, was a successful, educated farmer from Billings. He was a pacifist.
He just thought that the United States should never have entered this war. And by doing so, he was sentenced to 48 years.
A mob took him from his home for refusing to support the war or to buy war bonds. His infant son died while he was incarcerated. Heather says then Warden Frank Connolly refused to allow him to attend his boy's funeral.
And at the same time, his little boy was being put 6 feet under. Mr. Bausch was put in a ditch 6 feet down, digging out mud and muck.
She reads a letter from Warden Connolly.
"There are a lot of Germans outside who ought to be in, meaning the prison. When we get one in, meaning a German, we're going to keep him."
When Fay Rumsey criticized the government, he was taken from his homestead, his wife, and 12 children.
His wife tried to keep it going, the homestead, and she couldn't. And her children were taken away, and some were put in the orphanage.
Heather says government officials could benefit from such takings.
The sheriffs would end up with these individual homesteads, the land.
William and Janet Smith were married.
Was the only female to be incarcerated.
Many statements were thoughtful, others full of bluster and bravado, some profane. Union organizer Frank Little is first in line in the exhibit. He didn't serve time here for sedition. He was murdered for speaking out against the Anaconda Copper Mining Company.
Shackled him to the back of a car, dragged him across the cobblestones of Butte. Then they hanged him on the Anaconda trestle.
His murder is still unsolved.
Just about every one of these worked. They paid the government taxes. They were just like every one of us.
Here you feel the isolation of the cold. From behind these walls you can see the mountains, worlds away from iron bars.
They stay with you. It's almost like they haunt you.
Of all these faces, Heather Gregory is most haunted by this man.
I remember poor Leo Reno.
He went insane, she says, and died in the state mental institution.
I think he was maybe mentally challenged. So I don't think he really meant any harm. I think he just went with the flow.
Heather remembers all of them.
Mr. Rhodes, 74 years old. I remember him. Mr. Burling, I remember him. His name is very British, Ellsworth Burling. I just want people to realize how important their freedoms are and how quickly it can be taken away. Leo Reno.
It can, she believes, and is happening again.
Faye
Kevin
Ramsey.
Mackey, NBC, Montana.
Ellsworth Burling, Ed Horn, they're all there. I just remember them all.